What if everything you were told about power was a deliberate lie? Not a mistake, not an oversight, a lie, constructed with precision, maintained with patience, and enforced by the very systems that benefit from your ignorance. What if the names change? Machiavelli, Rothschild, Musk, but the philosophy never does. What if the game has always been the same game, and the only thing that separates the players from the pawns is the willingness to see it clearly? Pay very close attention to what comes next, because most people spend their entire lives reacting to a world they never truly understand. They watch the news and see chaos. They observe the wealthy and feel resentment. They read history and see coincidence. But you are not most people. You would not be here if you were. Something in you already suspects that the surface story, the one told by textbooks, by media, by comfortable voices in comfortable rooms, is not the full story. Something in you already knows that power does not announce itself. It never has. It never will. And that suspicion, that quiet, uncomfortable suspicion, that is the beginning of real intelligence. Machiavelli understood this 5 centuries ago. He sat in the ruins of his political career, stripped of office, tortured, exiled to a small farm outside Florence, and he wrote the most dangerous book in human history. Not because it was violent, not because it was immoral, but because it was honest, brutally, surgically, mercilessly honest about how power actually operates versus how people pretend it operates. He wrote The Prince not as a manifesto of evil, but as a mirror held up to a world that could not bear to look at its own reflection. They banned his book. They burned his manuscripts. They called him the devil's advisor. And yet every ruler, every dynasty, every empire builder who came after him read him in secret, because you cannot govern what you do not understand, and you cannot understand power if you insist on viewing it through the lens of how you wish the world worked, rather than how it actually does. Now, fast forward 500 years. You see a man named Elon Musk, the richest human being on the planet, dismantling one of the world's largest social media platforms, purchasing it in a move that the entire media establishment called reckless, impulsive, self-destructive. Analysts predicted catastrophe, advertisers fled, commentators laughed. And then, quietly, strategically, methodically, the man rebuilt it in his image, renamed it, restructured it, turned it into a direct communication weapon that bypassed every traditional media filter between him and 300 million people. Was that impulsive? Or was it Machiavellian? You see a family name, Rothschild, that has survived wars, revolutions, the collapse of empires, 2 world wars, the rise and fall of nations, the complete restructuring of the global financial system no fewer than 4 times in 2 centuries. A family that has been the subject of conspiracy theories, persecution, envy, and fear for over 200 years. A family that, despite all of this, despite the hatred, the confiscations, the threats, remains relevant, connected, and powerful. Was that luck, or was it philosophy? Because here is what nobody tells you. Here is the truth that sits beneath the noise of history, beneath the headlines, beneath the endless debate about whether these men are heroes or villains, visionaries or manipulators. The philosophy is the same. The clothes are different. The centuries are different. The technologies, the industries, the contexts, all different. But the core operating system, the fundamental way of thinking about power, about influence, about survival, about legacy, is identical. It runs on the same code. And that code has a name. It has always had a name. Machiavelli gave it a name 500 years ago. And the world has been trying to forget that name ever since, because the name is not comfortable. The name does not fit on motivational posters. The name does not make for pleasant dinner conversation. The name acknowledges something about human nature that most people desperately, frantically, perpetually refuse to accept. Power is amoral, not immoral, amoral. Power does not care whether you are good or bad, kind or cruel, honest or deceptive. Power responds only to skill. It responds to patience. It responds to the clarity of vision in those who pursue it without flinching. Power is, in this sense, the most democratic force in the universe. It is available to anyone willing to understand its true nature, and that is precisely why it is so fiercely guarded. If everyone understood how power actually works, the current holders of it would be threatened. So they teach you instead about fairness, about meritocracy, about hard work leading to success in a straight, visible, predictable line. They teach you that the powerful rose because they deserved it, and the implication, always unspoken, always carefully obscured, is that if you haven't risen, you don't deserve to. You haven't worked hard enough. You haven't been good enough. The fault is yours. And while you internalize that shame, while you work harder inside a system designed to extract maximum effort for minimum reward, the people who understand Machiavelli's code are doing something entirely different. They are not working harder. They are thinking differently. There is a moment in Machiavelli's life that most historians gloss over. After his imprisonment and torture by the Medici, after the physical and psychological devastation of being stripped of everything he had built, he retired to his farm in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, and every evening he would change out of his farmer's clothes, put on his finest robes, and sit at his desk to read and write. He said that when he entered his study, dressed in his court clothes, he entered the courts of ancient men, Caesar, Livy, Thucydides, and spoke with them about power, about strategy, about the eternal patterns of human ambition. He was broke, he was disgraced, he was in exile, and he was still thinking like a sovereign. That is the first lesson. That is the foundation upon which everything else in this video will be built. Before we examine the specific mechanics of what Musk does, before we dissect the Rothschild methodology, before we extract the applicable wisdom from Machiavelli's philosophy, you need to understand the prerequisite. You need to understand the single most important distinction between the person who operates in the world of power and the person who is operated upon by it. The distinction is not wealth, it is not connections, it is not luck, birth, talent, or timing. It is the willingness to see the game as it actually is and to stop pretending it is something more comfortable. Most people live inside a story. The story says that the world is fundamentally fair, that good intentions are rewarded, that transparency earns trust, that honesty is always the best policy, and that the powerful achieve their power through virtue. This story is comforting. It is also, in the specific domain of power, almost entirely false, and the cost of believing it is not merely intellectual. The cost is strategic. The cost is that every decision you make based on a false model of reality will produce outcomes you did not expect and cannot explain. You have been there. You know exactly what that feels like. You worked harder than someone who got promoted over you. You were more honest than someone who was trusted more than you. You were more loyal than someone who was rewarded more than you. And instead of concluding that your model of the world was inaccurate, you concluded that you were unlucky, that the system was unfair, that the other person was better connected, better looking, better at politics. All of that may be true, but none of it is the real answer. The real answer is that they were operating from a different philosophy, consciously or not, and often unconsciously, passed down through family, culture, environment. They were operating from a set of principles closer to Machiavelli's than to the story you were told in school. And until you understand those principles, not to become unethical, not to become ruthless in the crude, destructive sense, but to see them clearly, to understand how they function in the world around you, to stop being surprised when they appear, you will continue to be operated upon rather than operating. This video is not a moral argument. It is not going to tell you that Machiavelli was right and kindness is weakness. It is not going to tell you to become calculating and cold and to treat people as instruments. That is not what Machiavelli actually said, and that misreading of him is itself a product of the same system of comfortable lies that keeps most people strategically blind. What this video is going to do is show you the architecture, the actual underlying, rarely articulated architecture of how durable power is built, maintained, and transmitted across generations. Using 3 reference points: a philosopher who mapped it 5 centuries ago, a dynasty that has lived it for 2 centuries, and a living operator who embodies it today in real time, in public, in ways you can observe and study if you know what to look for. By the end, you will not be the same person who pressed play. Not because you will have become someone else, but because you will have become more fully, more clearly, more unflinchingly yourself, without the story, without the comfortable illusion, without the strategic blindness that has been costing you, quietly, consistently, in every negotiation, every relationship, every room you have ever entered, wondering why you felt invisible. Machiavelli wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." People quote that line endlessly. They use it as evidence of his cruelty, his amorality, his nihilism. But they almost never finish the sentence, and they almost never examine the full context. Because the full context reveals something entirely different from cruelty. It reveals a precise understanding of the mechanics of influence, of what actually creates reliable, durable social and political outcomes versus what creates the feeling of those outcomes while actually producing fragility. Love, Machiavelli observed, is conditional. It depends on the continued generosity, the continued performance, the continued meeting of expectations of the person who is loved. When circumstances change, when the gifts stop, when the favor dries up, when the luck turns, love evaporates, not because people are evil, because love in the political and social sense is fundamentally transactional. It is tied to what you provide. Fear, properly understood, not as terror but as respect calibrated with consequence, is more stable. It does not depend on your continued performance. It does not evaporate when your fortunes temporarily fall. It is rooted in something more durable than gratitude, which is the recognition of your capacity. Now think about Elon Musk. Do people love him? Some do, passionately, devotedly, in ways that are almost religious in their fervor, but that is not the source of his power. The source of his power is that the world and governments, regulators, competitors, allies has come to understand that he is capable of things they cannot easily predict or contain, that his capacity extends further than they initially estimated, that underestimating him produces consequences. That is not love. That is Machiavellian respect. Now think about the Rothschild family at their peak, the mid-19th century, when Nathan Meyer Rothschild in London was simultaneously financing the British government, funding Wellington's campaigns against Napoleon, and maintaining banking relationships across 5 European capitals through his brothers. The word that contemporaries used most consistently to describe Nathan was not kind. It was not beloved. It was not even brilliant. Though he was all of those things, the word was formidable. He was formidable. And the specific quality that made him formidable was not his wealth, though his wealth was extraordinary. It was the recognition held by everyone who dealt with him that he understood the game more completely than they did, that he saw further, that engaging with him carelessly was a mistake from which you might not recover. That is the same principle, 500 years apart, in radically different contexts, using radically different tools, the same philosophy. And here is the question you need to sit with, not as an academic exercise, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a genuine strategic inquiry. What would change in your life if you operated from that philosophy? Not recklessly, not crudely, not by abandoning your ethics or your relationships or your humanity, but strategically, deliberately, with the clarity of someone who has stopped pretending the world is other than it is, and started working with reality rather than against the fantasy of what you wish reality would be. Everything, in the specific domain of power and influence, would change. Everything. That is the promise of this video. Not comfort, not motivation, not a list of 5 things successful people do before breakfast. A genuine structural shift in how you understand the forces that govern every room you enter, every relationship you navigate, every negotiation you conduct, every ambition you either pursue or quietly abandon, because the story you were told made it seem impossible. It is not impossible. It never was. It was only invisible. Until now. Continue watching, because what comes next is not theory, it is architecture. And once you see the architecture, you cannot unsee it. You will walk into every room differently. You will read every headline differently. You will understand, for the first time with full clarity, why certain people accumulate and hold power across decades and centuries, while others, equally talented, equally driven, equally deserving by any fair standard, remain perpetually on the outside. The difference is the philosophy. And the philosophy is about to become yours, Machiavelli said. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. Not because deception is noble, but because understanding the full spectrum of available moves is the prerequisite for never being outmaneuvered. You have been playing with half the board. It is time to see the whole game. Stay with me. Because the next part is where everything begins to crack open, where the specific mechanics of how Machiavelli's framework maps onto the Rothschild dynasty maps onto Elon Musk's operational genius become unmistakably, undeniably clear. And once you see it, you will understand why this knowledge has always been kept just out of reach of the people who need it most. Just out of reach. Until now. Now we go deeper. Now we move past the revelation and into the architecture itself, because understanding that a different philosophy exists is only the entry point. The real transformation, the kind that actually changes how you move through the world, requires something more demanding. It requires you to look at the specific structural principles that underpin this philosophy and to recognize them, with uncomfortable clarity, as patterns you have already seen 1,000 times without ever having the framework to name them. That changes today. Machiavelli's philosophy rests on 5 pillars, 5 fundamental principles that, when held simultaneously, create the operating system that has allowed certain individuals and families to accumulate and maintain power across generations, across revolutions, across the complete restructuring of the world's political and economic order. These are not abstract philosophical concepts. They are operational tools. They are the specific instruments through which the Rothschild dynasty navigated 2 centuries of chaos, and through which Elon Musk has, in less than 3 decades, built a position in human civilization that is genuinely without modern parallel. Let us name them, and then let us dissect them. The first pillar, the mastery of appearances. Machiavelli wrote something in chapter 18 of The Prince that has been quoted, misquoted, and misunderstood for 5 centuries. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. He was not advocating for hypocrisy. He was making a precise observation about the mechanics of human cognition. People, all people, including the most intelligent, make their decisions about others based primarily on appearances, on surface signals, on the story they construct from available evidence rather than from direct, unmediated access to reality. You know this is true. You have judged people based on how they dressed before they spoke. You have formed opinions of rooms before you understood who was in them. You have made assumptions about organizations, products, and individuals based on how they presented themselves long before you had any substantive information about their actual quality or character. This is not a weakness. It is how human cognition works, efficiently and inevitably in a world of information overload. The Machiavellian operator does not bemoan this, does not rail against the superficiality of human judgment, does not heroically insist on being seen as they truly are, regardless of the cost. The Machiavellian operator works with this reality, understands it as a feature of the landscape, and designs their appearances accordingly. Look at how the Rothschild family managed their public image across 2 centuries. In their early years, when Meyer Amschel Rothschild was building his business from the Frankfurt Judengasse, the cramped ghetto where Jews in Frankfurt were legally confined, the family operated with deliberate opacity. They were not secretive out of paranoia. They were strategic. They understood that displaying wealth prematurely before their position was consolidated would attract the kind of attention that destroyed fragile operations. So they lived modestly. They dressed modestly. They conducted themselves with a quietness that masked the extraordinary financial architecture they were constructing beneath the surface. Then, as their position solidified, the appearances shifted. The great houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Naples. The art collections. The social connections with aristocracy. The presence at the highest levels of European governance. These were not expressions of vanity. They were strategic signals, carefully calibrated appearances designed to communicate to the world's most powerful actors that engagement with the Rothschilds was engagement with peers, not with mere merchants. The appearance changed with the strategic requirement. The underlying philosophy did not. Now look at Elon Musk. The man tweets things that seem chaotic, impulsive, even self-destructive to outside observers. He publicly smokes marijuana on a podcast and watches SpaceX stock react. He names his child with a string of symbols and letters that no one can pronounce. He picks fights with regulators, with the SEC, with established media institutions, with settled consensus on subjects ranging from electric vehicles to artificial intelligence to the colonization of Mars. He appears, to those operating from the conventional model of executive behavior, to be dangerously, recklessly uncontrolled. But step back. Look at the pattern beneath the chaos. Every single act of apparent recklessness has either consolidated his brand identity as the man who cannot be contained by conventional expectations, or has generated the kind of attention that no advertising budget could purchase. The chaos is the appearance. The control is the reality. And the people who cannot see past the appearance, who write the breathless articles about how this time he has finally gone too far, who predict the inevitable collapse of his authority, are people who have never understood Machiavelli's first pillar. They see the performance, they miss the strategy. You will not miss it anymore. The second pillar, the economics of virtue. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Machiavelli's philosophy and the most important. Because when most people engage with his work, even those who have read it rather than simply absorb the cultural mythology around it, they come away with the impression that he was dismissing virtue, arguing that goodness is weakness, that only the ruthless succeed. This is precisely wrong. What Machiavelli actually argued was something far more sophisticated and far more actionable. He argued that virtue, in the conventional moral sense, is an extraordinarily powerful tool when deployed strategically and at the right moments, and that the error of most well-intentioned people is not that they are too virtuous, but that they deploy their virtue indiscriminately, without calculation, without awareness of context, without understanding its actual mechanics of effect. Generosity displayed to those who cannot reciprocate it is waste. Generosity displayed at the precise moment when it will be remembered, when the recipient has both the capacity and the motivation to honor it, when the act will generate disproportionate return in loyalty, in reputation, in strategic alliance, and that is genius. Honesty offered to an enemy who will weaponize it is self-destruction. Honesty deployed in a moment where it demonstrates confidence, where it signals the security of someone who does not fear transparency, where it differentiates you from competitors who are visibly, obviously managing the truth. That is a weapon. Mercy extended to a defeated rival who remains dangerous invites revenge. Mercy extended to a defeated rival who poses no further threat in public, in a way that the entire observing world understands as a deliberate display of strength and security. That is power projection. Machiavelli was not anti-virtue. He was anti-naivety. He was arguing that the person who does good things without understanding the strategic mechanics of their impact is not more moral than the person who deploys goodness deliberately. They are simply less effective. And in a world where the stakes are high, where power, survival, and legacy are in play, being less effective is not a virtue. It is a failure. Look at how Nathan Meyer Rothschild operated during and after the Napoleonic Wars. He was not a man of conspicuous generosity. He was famously blunt, famously unsentimental, famously focused on the economics of every transaction. But at critical moments he chose with extraordinary precision, he demonstrated exactly the kind of calculated virtue that Machiavelli was describing. His financing of the British war effort, his personal risk-taking in moving gold across a continent at war, his willingness to extend credit to governments that others had written off. These were acts that looked, to outside observers, like confidence or even recklessness. They were strategic virtue. He was building something more durable than profit. He was building the reputation that would allow the Rothschild name to be synonymous for 2 centuries, with financial reliability in conditions of maximum uncertainty. He was creating the brand, before the concept of branding existed, that would open every door, survive every crisis, outlast every competitor. That reputation was not an accident. It was constructed, pillar by pillar, transaction by transaction, through the precise calculated deployment of demonstrable virtue at the moments of maximum strategic impact. Now look at Elon Musk's use of the same principle. SpaceX, in its early years, was failing. 3 rockets exploded. The company was weeks from bankruptcy. The conventional executive in that position, the person operating from the standard playbook, would have managed the narrative, hired crisis communications consultants, softened the language, lowered expectations. What Musk did instead was something that looked from the outside like stubborn irrationality. He put his last available capital into a fourth launch. He told his employees the truth. This was the last shot. He was transparent about the stakes in a way that the modern corporate world almost never tolerates. The rocket succeeded, and that act, that specific combination of transparency, personal financial sacrifice, and calculated all-in commitment, became one of the most powerful brand-building moments in the history of American entrepreneurship. Not because it was planned as a PR moment, but because the principles behind it were Machiavellian in the deepest sense. The virtue was real. The timing and context made it into a legend. The third pillar, the architecture of information. Machiavelli understood something that only a handful of his contemporaries grasped, that information is not merely useful. Information is the substrate of power. Whoever controls what others know, and what they do not know, controls the decisions they make. And whoever controls the decisions others make controls outcomes far beyond what physical or financial force alone could achieve. This is not a modern insight. It is ancient. But Machiavelli codified it, made it explicit, turned it into a transferable principle, rather than simply a talent that some leaders possessed and others lacked. The Rothschild family's ascent was built, in no small part, on an information advantage that was the direct product of deliberate strategy rather than fortunate circumstance. Meyer Amschel Rothschild placed his sons in the 5 major financial capitals of Europe, not simply to expand his business geographically. He placed them there to create a private intelligence network that no government, no competitor, no rival financial house could match. His sons wrote to him and to each other constantly. They reported not just on financial conditions, but on political developments, on the health of rulers, on the movements of armies, on the mood of populations. The Rothschilds knew things before other people knew them. The most famous example, though its details have been mythologized beyond what the historical record fully supports, is the period surrounding the Battle of Waterloo. What is beyond dispute is that the Rothschilds had better, faster access to political and financial intelligence than their competitors, and that this informational advantage, compounded over decades, translated into financial decisions that were consistently, structurally superior to those of people operating on slower, lower-quality information. This is the third pillar in its purest form. Not intelligence in the sense of raw cognitive ability, though that matters. Intelligence in the operational sense, the deliberate construction of systems and relationships that ensure you know more, sooner, with greater accuracy, than the people you are competing with, negotiating with, or simply navigating around. Now look at what Elon Musk did when he acquired Twitter. The immediate, obvious interpretation was that he overpaid for a declining platform out of some combination of ego, ideology, and impulsivity. The story the media told, and continues to tell, is of a billionaire who bought something recklessly and has been managing the fallout ever since. But look at what he actually acquired. He acquired, at a price that can be debated, direct access to the real-time information flow of the global political and cultural conversation. He acquired a platform through which every major political figure, every major media institution, every major business leader in the world communicates publicly. He acquired the data, the metadata, the behavioral patterns, the networks of 300 million of the world's most influential people, and he acquired the ability to determine, architecturally, what information is amplified and what is suppressed in that conversation. That is not a social media platform, that is an information architecture. Seen through Machiavelli's third pillar, the acquisition, whatever its financial merits, makes perfect strategic sense. The fourth pillar, the patience of the long game. This is perhaps the pillar most alien to the modern mentality, and therefore the most powerful competitive advantage for the person who can genuinely internalize it. We live in a world of quarterly earnings reports, of viral moments, of attention cycles that measure significance in days and weeks. The pace of modern life has created a systematic, structural bias toward the short term, toward the immediately visible, toward the move that produces results fast enough to be credited to the person who made it. Machiavelli operated in a different temporal framework. He understood that the most durable power is built through moves whose returns accumulate over years and decades, moves that look neutral or even costly in the short term, and only reveal their strategic logic in retrospect when the position they built has become so consolidated that competitors are unable to meaningfully challenge it. The Rothschild dynasty is the most spectacular historical example of this pillar in operation. Mayer Amschel Rothschild did not build a banking empire. He built a legacy architecture, a system specifically designed to accumulate power across generations rather than within a single lifetime. His insistence on keeping the business within the family, his practice of arranging marriages within or adjacent to the family network, his explicit instructions to his sons about maintaining solidarity against outside pressure, these were not the acts of a man optimizing for his own generation. They were the acts of someone thinking in decades and centuries. The Rothschild family did not simply survive 2 world wars, the abolition of aristocracy, the rise of nation-states, the creation of central banking, the Great Depression, and the complete restructuring of the global financial system. They navigated all of these upheavals from a position of prior preparation, of accumulated relationship capital, of strategic positioning built long before the crises arrived, precisely because they had been thinking on a timescale that most of their contemporaries were constitutionally incapable of matching. Patience is not passivity. This is the crucial misunderstanding. The patient operator is not waiting. They are building. Every day, every conversation, every apparently small decision is a deposit into a long-term strategic position whose value will not be realized immediately, but is nonetheless real, compounding, structurally significant. The patient operator is the person in the room who appears most relaxed and is actually most active, because their activity is internal, architectural, invisible to those who equate action with visible urgency. Elon Musk's patient game is his simultaneous construction of multiple industries. The conventional analysis of Musk is to evaluate each company independently: Tesla versus the auto industry, SpaceX versus the aerospace industry, Neuralink versus neuroscience, XAI versus the AI industry. But this is the wrong unit of analysis. The right unit of analysis is the ecosystem, the interlocking network of positions across energy, transportation, artificial intelligence, communication, and eventually space that, taken together, constitute something no individual or institution in human history has ever attempted to build: a private, vertically integrated platform for human civilization. None of these moves makes maximum sense in isolation. Together, they form a position of such extraordinary scope and interconnection that, if even a fraction of them succeed at the scale he is pursuing, the resulting leverage will be without modern precedent. That is the long game. That is Machiavelli's 4th pillar, not as theory but as living strategy, visible and verifiable in real time. The 5th pillar, the sovereign posture. This is the internal dimension of the philosophy, the one that cannot be observed directly, but that manifests in every external behavior, every decision, every interaction. It is the dimension that most people attempting to apply these principles miss entirely, because it requires something more difficult than tactical skill. It requires a fundamental reorientation of identity. Machiavelli observed that there are 2 types of actors in any system of power. There are those who respond to the environment, who are shaped by the reactions of others, who calibrate their behavior based on external approval, who exist in a perpetual state of environmental dependency. And there are those who create the environment, who establish the terms of interaction, who move first from internal principle rather than external reaction, who are experienced by everyone around them as somehow more solid, more present, more gravitationally dense than ordinary actors. He called this quality virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, something more specific. The quality of a person who is fully, unapologetically, operationally sovereign over their own conduct. The sovereign posture is not arrogance. It is not indifference. It is not the crude performance of dominance that insecure people mistake for strength. It is something quieter and far more powerful, the complete internal absence of the need for external validation as the basis for action. The sovereign acts from principle, from calculation, from vision, not from the hunger for approval that drives most human behavior, and, in doing so, makes most humans predictable, manageable, and ultimately controllable by whoever is willing to withhold or dispense the approval they need. This is the quality that makes Musk genuinely unpredictable. Not his wealth, not his intelligence, not his risk tolerance, though all of these matter. The quality that makes him genuinely difficult to contain or predict is that he appears to have, to an extraordinary degree, detached his sense of self from the approval of the institutions, the consensus, the established order that governs the behavior of almost every other actor at his level. He will be mocked, he will be criticized, he will be investigated and regulated and opposed, and he will continue to act from whatever internal calculus he is running, regardless. Whether you admire him or despise him is irrelevant to the strategic observation. The strategic observation is, that is the sovereign posture. And in a world where almost everyone is operating from the need for external validation, the person who has genuinely transcended that need has an almost incomprehensible strategic advantage, because you cannot control someone who does not need your approval. That is the fifth pillar, and that is the foundation of everything we are going to build in the second half of this video, because knowing these 5 pillars is not enough. Understanding them intellectually, nodding along, feeling the resonance, acknowledging the truth of them, is not transformation. Transformation requires something harder. It requires you to look honestly at where you are not operating from these principles, where you are still performing for approval, where you are still thinking in the short term, where you are still confusing your narrative about the world with the world itself, where you are still deployed your virtues naively, without strategic awareness of their actual impact. That is the work, and the most cold-blooded move of all, the most freer, the coldest, most disciplined, most strategically decisive thing you can do, is to begin that work now, not tomorrow, not when circumstances are better, not when you feel ready, because you will never feel ready for this kind of seeing. The readiness comes after the decision, not before it. Machiavelli ended The Prince with a passionate appeal to the young Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler he had written the book to advise. He said, "The opportunity is not to be missed." He had seen too many men wait for perfect conditions. He had watched too many capable, intelligent, genuinely powerful people squander their potential in the comfortable hesitation of preparation. The opportunity is not to be missed. The next section of this video is where philosophy becomes practice, where the 5 pillars become specific, actionable instruments that you can begin deploying immediately, in the conversations you will have tomorrow, in the decisions you will face next week, in the negotiations, relationships, and strategic positions you are building right now, whether you know it or not. But before we get there, one final warning. The coldest move is also the most dangerous. Because once you see the game, truly, fully, without the comfortable fog of the story you were told, you cannot pretend you don't see it. The ignorance that protected your comfort is gone, and what you do with the clarity that replaces it will define not just your strategy, but your character. Machiavelli was not without ethics. He was without illusions. There is a difference, and knowing that difference, living that difference, operating from that difference every single day, is the beginning of the sovereign life that every great philosopher, every great dynasty builder, every great operator in human history has understood, practiced, and refused to apologize for. The coldest play is still ahead. Stay with me. This is where the theory ends and the transformation begins. Everything you have heard so far, the 5 pillars, the historical patterns, the parallel between a Renaissance philosopher, a 2-century dynasty, and a living billionaire, all of it means nothing if it stays in the abstract. Philosophy that does not change behavior is decoration. Wisdom that does not alter your decisions is vanity. The only test of whether you have truly understood something is what you do differently afterward. So let us get specific. Let us talk about you. Not about Musk's media strategy or the Rothschild family's inheritance structures. about the actual concrete situations you face every single day, at work, in relationships, in social environments, in the private theater of your own mind, where these 5 pillars are not abstract principles, but actionable tools that would produce measurably different outcomes if you deployed them with the clarity and precision that the philosophy demands. We begin with what I call the visibility trap. Most people, without ever examining it, without ever choosing it consciously, operate on the assumption that visibility equals power, that being seen, being heard, being acknowledged, being present in the minds of others is the foundation of influence. So they talk when they should listen. They explain when they should remain silent. They react when they should observe. They fill silences that, left unfilled, would have told them everything they needed to know. The visibility trap is the single most exploitable weakness in the social and professional landscape, because while the person who needs to be seen is performing, constructing their image, managing their narrative, filling the space with evidence of their value, the person who understands Machiavelli's first pillar is gathering information, is observing the patterns in how others behave when they believe they are the most important person in the room, is building a picture of the landscape that will be unavailable to the performer who is too busy performing to see it. Here is a specific scenario. You have probably lived a version of this. You are in a meeting. There are 12 people in the room. 8 of them speak in the first 15 minutes, establishing their positions, signaling their knowledge, demonstrating their engagement, performing their competence for whoever they perceive as the decision-maker in the room. The conversation is loud, competitive, mildly performative. People talk over each other. People repeat points that have already been made, just to be associated with the correct position. And then there are the 4 who have not yet spoken. The conventional interpretation of those 4 is that they are either disengaged or intimidated, or simply have nothing to contribute. This interpretation is almost always wrong, and the fact that it is almost always made is itself a gift to those who understand it. The 4 who are not speaking are, in most cases, doing something the 8 cannot do simultaneously with speaking. They are reading the room. They are mapping the power relationships, the alliances, the insecurities, the agendas beneath the stated agendas. They are identifying where the actual decision-making authority lies, which is rarely where it appears to lie. They are waiting for the moment, the precise non-arbitrary moment, when their contribution will land with maximum weight, uncrowded by competing voices, in a room whose dynamics they now understand far better than any of the 8 who have been too busy talking to observe. When that person speaks, finally, deliberately, in the measured silence they have chosen, rather than the anxious noise they have avoided, they speak into a room that is primed to receive them. That is Machiavelli's first pillar in action. That is the mastery of appearances, not the performance of engagement, but the strategic management of presence that creates the impression of measured authority rather than reactive visibility. Practice this tomorrow. In one meeting, one conversation, one social situation, choose to speak less than you are inclined to, not passively, actively less. Listen past the first thing people say to the second and third thing, which is almost always more revealing. Watch what people reveal when they are managing their image, and you are not managing yours. Watch how the room changes when you are present, but not performing. The information you gather will be worth more than anything you could have said. Now let us talk about the reciprocity architecture, Machiavelli's second pillar made concrete. The error most people make with generosity is randomness. They are kind when they feel kind. They help when helping feels natural. They give credit when the credit is obvious, and the giving of it costs them nothing. This is not strategic virtue. This is virtue on autopilot, and virtue on autopilot produces warm feelings and no durable strategic advantage. Strategic virtue means that every act of generosity, every expression of loyalty, every demonstration of fairness is a deliberate investment in a specific relationship at a specific moment chosen for maximum impact. Here is how to think about this. In any environment, professional or social, there are 3 categories of people. There are the people who are currently powerful and do not need your investment, because they are already well supplied with loyalty and generosity from people who want something from them. There are the people who are currently irrelevant and who will remain so regardless of your investment. And there are the people who are currently underestimated, who are in a transitional moment, who are about to become significantly more important, who are in the position of owing future debt that has not yet been called. The Rothschild family's genius in their early years was the precise identification of this third category. When Meyer Amschel Rothschild began his business relationship with Wilhelm II of Hesse, Wilhelm was not yet the elector, not yet the ruler of one of Europe's most strategically positioned territories. He was a prince, a promising, wealthy, well-connected prince, but a prince. Most financial houses of the era were focused on serving the already powerful, the already credentialed, the already established. Rothschild invested in Wilhelm early, served him with extraordinary diligence, and built a relationship based on genuine reliability, rather than merely competitive pricing. When Wilhelm became the elector, when his importance increased dramatically and his need for a trustworthy financial manager became critical, he did not need to go looking for a new relationship. The relationship already existed. The trust had already been built, slowly before it was needed, precisely because it was built before it was needed. That is strategic virtue. That is the reciprocity architecture. Who in your current environment is in the transitional moment, who is currently underestimated, either by themselves or by others, but is moving toward a position of greater significance. And what would it mean, specifically, concretely, to invest genuine value in that relationship now, before the investment is obviously valuable, before everyone else is scrambling to make the same investment? Think about this carefully, because the opposite is also true. The most common mistake in the reciprocity architecture is not failing to invest in the right people. It is continuing to invest in people who are no longer capable of return, who take your generosity as entitlement, who have long since stopped responding to your investment with anything but expectation of more investment. Machiavelli was merciless about this. The prince, he wrote, must know when a relationship has become a drain rather than an exchange, and he must know how to extricate himself from it without creating unnecessary enemies. This is a conversation you need to have with yourself about at least one relationship in your life right now. You know which one. Now let us talk about what Machiavelli called the management of fortune, and what it looks like in the specific context of how you handle adversity, setback, and the moments when the world moves against you. Machiavelli's image for fortune was the river. He said that fortune is like a violent river. When it floods, it destroys, uproots, overwhelms everything in its path. But the wise prince, he observed, builds embankments and dams before the flood comes, in the times of quiet, so that when fortune turns violent, the damage is contained. Most people do not build embankments. Most people operate professionally and personally, at the edge of their capacity, their financial reserves stretched, their relationship capital deployed without replenishment, their strategic options narrowed by accumulated commitments that feel necessary rather than chosen. And when fortune turns violent, when the job disappears, when the relationship collapses, when the industry disrupts, when the market moves, they find themselves exposed, without the structural reserves that would allow them to weather the flood rather than be consumed by it. The Machiavellian operator never operates at the edge of their capacity. They maintain strategic reserves, financial, relational, informational, emotional, not as a hedge against their ambition, not as an excuse to pursue smaller goals, but as the non-negotiable foundation that allows them to pursue larger goals without being destroyed by the inevitable volatility that accompanies any serious ambition. The reserves are not a retreat from the game. They are the structural prerequisite for playing the longest possible version of the game. Elon Musk's most underappreciated operational habit is exactly this. He does not diversify in the conventional sense. He does not spread his bets across unrelated assets to reduce risk. But he constructs his positions such that the failure of any one of them, SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, XAI, would not eliminate his platform for continuing to operate. Each company is, in part, a strategic reserve for the others. The brand is a reserve. The public attention is a reserve. The network of relationships built through one venture provides options for another. The architecture is designed for durability through adversity, not merely for performance in favorable conditions. This is what you need to build, in whatever domain you are operating in, not necessarily in his scale, his industry, his specific methods, but with the same underlying logic. Your position at any moment should be designed not just for what it produces when conditions are favorable, but for what it enables when conditions are not. Now let us go into the most difficult territory, the place where most people applying these principles fail, not because the principles are wrong, but because the application requires something that no tactical framework can substitute for. It requires the honest diagnosis of your own position in the 5 pillars. Not your position as you wish it to be. Not your position as your self-image describes it. Your actual current unsentimental position on the mastery of appearances. Are you genuinely managing how you present yourself in high-stakes situations, or are you operating on autopilot, appearing in ways that were formed by habit and circumstance rather than chosen with strategic clarity? When you walk into a room where your interests are in play, do you know what signal you are sending before you open your mouth? Do you know how you are read by people who have just met you? And is that reading accurate and useful to your actual goals? On the economics of virtue, are you generous deliberately or randomly? Are you honest strategically or reflexively? Do you understand with any precision what return your acts of virtue are actually generating in the relationships that matter most to your long-term position? Or are you simply being kind because kindness feels right and hoping, without analysis, that it will work out? On the architecture of information, do you have an active, intentional system for knowing more than your competitors, your colleagues, your adversaries? Or do you receive information passively, reacting to what reaches you rather than constructing the channels that ensure you are among the first to know what matters? Do you understand the information ecology of the environments you operate in? On the patience of the long game, what is your actual time horizon when you make decisions about your career, your investments, your relationships, your public identity? Are you optimizing for the next 6 months or the next 6 years? Are you making moves whose value will compound over time, or are you responding to immediate pressures in ways that produce short-term relief at the cost of long-term position? On the sovereign posture, whose approval are you still seeking that you should have outgrown? What decisions are you not making because of fear of specific people's reactions? What version of yourself are you suppressing in professional or social environments because the authentic version seems too risky, too unusual, too difficult to defend against the judgment of people whose judgment you have assigned more authority than they deserve? These are not comfortable questions. If they were comfortable, they would not be useful. The person who can answer these questions honestly, without flinching, without the defensive maneuvers that the ego deploys to protect its comfortable self-image, is already further along the path than 90% of the people who will watch this video. Because most people cannot even formulate the questions. They live inside the answers without ever having the framework to examine them. You now have the framework. Use it like the weapon it is. Machiavelli wrote, "A man who is used to acting in one way never changes. He is ruined when the times in changing no longer are in harmony with his ways." The most dangerous thing in any environment of change, and we live in an environment of perpetual, accelerating change, is the rigidity of a person who has confused their habits with their identity, who cannot distinguish between how they have operated and how they should operate, who mistakes familiarity for strategy. The person who cannot change their approach when the environment demands it will be destroyed by the environment. This is not metaphor. Look at every industry that has been disrupted in the last 20 years. Look at the people who saw it coming and repositioned. Look at the people who could not see it, because seeing it would have required them to question not just their tactics, but their identity. The deep, uncomfortable, threatening possibility that the way they had been operating was a product of a specific environment that no longer existed. You are not that person. You chose to be here. You chose to see. But seeing is only the first act. The second act is moving. And the third act, the one that most people who see never reach, is staying in motion. Continuing to revise, to adapt, to incorporate new information into your model of the world without the ego protection that turns a useful past model into a cognitive prison. That is the full practice of Machiavellian intelligence in the modern world, not a set of tricks, not a collection of manipulation techniques. A genuine, demanding, lifelong commitment to operating from reality rather than from the story you were told about reality, no matter how much more comfortable the story might be. The transformation is not an event, it is a practice. And it begins right now, in this moment, in the specific place in your life where you know with total clarity and total honesty that you have been operating from the story instead of from the truth. It begins there, right there. The final movement of this video is not going to give you more information. More information is not what is needed now. What is needed now is the integration, the moment where everything you have absorbed in the last hour crystallizes into a new self-understanding so clear and so complete that no external opinion can shake it. That moment is the next one. And it is the most important thing I will say. Something has already changed in you. You may not have a name for it yet. You may not be able to locate it precisely in the architecture of what was said, or in the specific moment when the shift occurred, but you are not the same person who pressed play at the beginning of this video, and the reason you are not the same person has nothing to do with what you were told. It has everything to do with what you allowed yourself to see. Most people spend their entire lives being told what to see. They consume information designed to maintain a comfortable picture of the world, a picture in which power is distributed fairly, in which the rules are as they appear, in which hard work and good intentions are sufficient to navigate any landscape. They live inside that picture the way a person lives inside a dream, convinced of its reality, unable to see its edges, unable to locate the mechanisms of its construction. You walked out of the dream today, not because someone woke you, but because you chose to wake. That distinction is everything. The person who is awakened by circumstances, by the shock of betrayal, by the violence of an unexpected failure, by the collision with reality that the comfortable dream could no longer absorb, is reactive. They see because they have been forced to. And reactive seeing, while real, while often profound, carries with it the residue of the shock that produced it, the bitterness, the resentment, the desire for revenge that cloud the strategic clarity that real power requires. You did not wake because of a crisis. You woke because you walked in. You chose the discomfort. You chose the challenge. You chose the territory beyond the edge of the comfortable story. And that choice, that specific, voluntary act of intellectual courage, is the first real expression of the sovereign posture we described in the second movement of this video. You are already practicing it, right now, without being asked. Let us name what you have become in this hour. You are now someone who understands that appearances are not deceptions to be resented. They are environments to be designed. You understand that the signal you project before you speak, before you act, before you have any opportunity to demonstrate your actual value, is itself a form of communication, and that the failure to manage that signal is not honesty, it is strategic negligence. You are now someone who understands that virtue is not diminished by intention, that the person who is generous because it is strategically wise is no less generous than the person who gives on impulse, and is considerably more useful because their generosity is directed where it can actually produce the outcomes that goodness should produce in a world that does not automatically reward it. You are now someone who understands that information is not passively received, it is actively constructed, that the person who designs their information channels, who builds relationships specifically for the intelligence value they provide, who reads the room rather than performing for it, is operating in a fundamentally different epistemic environment from the person who simply reacts to whatever reaches them. You are now someone who understands time differently. This is perhaps the most profound shift, because once you internalize the long game, once you genuinely structurally shift your temporal horizon from months to decades, every decision you make changes character. The small insult that once would have demanded an immediate response becomes an observation for your files. The short-term sacrifice that once seemed like a loss becomes a visible investment in a position whose value is compounding. The relationship that once seemed irrelevant, because its current value is low, becomes a priority investment because its future value is clear to you and invisible to everyone else. You move on a different timescale now, and people who move on a different timescale are experienced by everyone around them as somehow heavier, more deliberate, more genuinely confident than people who are perpetually reacting to the present moment. Because they are. The person who is thinking 3 years ahead while everyone else is thinking 3 weeks ahead inhabits the same room but occupies a different order of reality. Their gravity is different. Their presence is different. Their silences mean more than other people's speeches. That is what Machiavelli was pointing toward when he described the qualities of the ideal prince. Not a catalogue of personality traits, a description of temporal consciousness, of the specific quality of awareness that results from genuinely, habitually thinking on the longest useful timescale rather than the shortest comfortable one. And then there is the sovereign posture. This is where the metamorphosis completes itself. Because you can understand every pillar, deploy every tactic, manage every appearance, invest every act of virtue with strategic precision, and still be fundamentally operating from the inside of the cage, still making decisions based on what you think others will approve of, still suppressing your most accurate perceptions because the social cost of expressing them seems too high, still performing a version of yourself calibrated to external expectations rather than internal sovereignty. The Rothschild family's most enduring quality, the quality that allowed them to maintain cohesion, purpose, and strategic direction across generations that most families cannot maintain across decades, was not their financial acumen. It was their refusal to define themselves by the definitions others imposed on them. They were persecuted. They were stereotyped. They were excluded from the political and social establishment of every country they operated in for most of their history. And rather than internalizing that exclusion, rather than allowing it to shrink their self-concept, to limit their ambition, to produce the apologetic posture that most people adopt in the face of systemic rejection, they operated as though the exclusion were simply irrelevant information, a feature of the landscape to be navigated, not a verdict on their worth. That is sovereignty, not the freedom from external opposition, that is impossible, but the freedom from the internal capitulation to external opposition that makes most people's lives a negotiation with other people's opinions of them rather than a direct expression of their own most genuine capacity. Musk's version of this sovereignty is visible and controversial and deliberately public in ways that the Rothschild version never was. But the underlying psychology is identical. The man behaves as though the institutional consensus, the settled opinions of regulators, of established media, of peer executives, of the entire apparatus of social and professional expectation simply does not have the authority over his behavior that it assumes it has. Not out of recklessness, out of a fundamental conviction that the source of legitimate authority over his conduct is internal, not external. You can disagree with his specific choices. That is beside the point. The point is the psychology. The point is the operating system. And the question, the one that only you can answer in the privacy of your own most honest self-examination, is this. Where are you still asking for permission? Where are you still waiting for an external signal that it is safe, acceptable, approved, to pursue the vision you actually hold, to make the move you already know is correct, to occupy the room at the level you are genuinely capable of, rather than the level you have been given permission to occupy? Where is the permission-seeking still happening? Because it is happening somewhere. In everyone, it is happening somewhere. The specific locations are different. For some it is professional, for some it is relational, for some it is creative, for some it is the private theater of ambition that has never been expressed because expression would require the risk of rejection. And rejection, somewhere in the unchallenged architecture of your psychology, still feels like more than you can survive. It is not more than you can survive. You have survived every previous instance of rejection, of judgment, of the world failing to validate what you knew was true about yourself. You are here. Every piece of evidence from your own history says that you survive the disapproval of others, that it does not in fact destroy you, that the discomfort of it is real and temporary and productive, rather than fatal and final. Machiavelli survived torture. He survived exile. He survived the complete collapse of everything he had spent his public life building. And he sat in his small study, put on his finest robes, and wrote the most enduring document on the philosophy of power in human history. The conditions were not favorable. He acted anyway. That is the paradox at the center of everything this video has been building toward. The paradox that the comfortable story conceals, because the comfortable story would like you to believe that the right conditions will eventually arrive. That the moment of clarity, the alignment of circumstances, the external permission that makes action feel safe will come if you wait long enough. It does not come. The clarity comes through the action. The safety is built by the acting, not given before it. The permission, the only permission that ever mattered, was always yours to give, has always been yours to give, has never required anyone else's signature. The insight is not comfortable. Nothing in this video has been designed for comfort. Comfort is the mechanism by which the story keeps you in place, keeps you performing rather than building, keeps you reacting rather than creating, keeps you waiting for a signal that will never come from a source that was never authorized to give it. Machiavelli said, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." But there is a prior question. The prior question is, what does the ruler look like when no one is watching? What does he pursue when there is no approval available, no audience, no performance context? What moves does he make in the silence of the real, unobserved game? That is the question this video has been asking you. Not about Musk, not about the Rothschilds, not even ultimately about Machiavelli, who is fascinating, who is essential, who mapped this territory with a precision that 5 centuries of subsequent thinkers have not improved upon in the fundamentals. About you, about what you do in the silence of the real, unobserved game, because here is the final truth, the one that sits beneath all 5 pillars, beneath the entire architecture of this philosophy, beneath the historical examples and the tactical frameworks and the specific applications we have worked through together. The power that matters is not the power that others see. It is the power that you actually have over the direction, the quality, and the meaning of your own life. Everything else, the influence, the reputation, the strategic position, the long game, the informational architecture, is downstream of this, is an expression of this, is, in the end, only as real and only as durable as the degree to which you have genuinely, irreversibly, sovereignly claimed the authority over your own existence. Musk is powerful because he acts as though he is powerful, not as a performance, as a reality. The belief preceded the evidence, not the other way around. The sovereignty was claimed before the conditions that justified it existed, and the conditions were in large part created by the claiming. The Rothschilds were unconquerable because they refused to be conquered internally long before their external position made unconquerability seem obvious or inevitable. The family cohesion, the generational continuity, the refusal to define themselves by the definitions of their enemies, these were not the products of their success. They were the causes of it. And Machiavelli, sitting in his ruined farm, stripped of office, marked by torture, exiled from everything he had served, produced the most enduring work of political philosophy in the Western tradition, not despite his conditions. Through his conditions, by choosing in the wreckage of his external world to maintain the absolute inviolable sovereignty of his internal one. That is the architecture. That is the philosophy. And it is, right now, in this moment, available to you in exactly the same measure it was available to them, not more difficult because of your circumstances, not less applicable because of your current position, not conditional on any change in the external world, available, now, here, exactly as you are. The person who watched the beginning of this video is not the same as the person who has arrived at this moment. That person was still inside the story, still viewing the world through the comfortable fog of a model that protected their current position at the cost of their actual potential. That person was still waiting for the signal, for the permission, for the alignment of conditions that would make the move feel safe. That person is gone. You are what remains after the comfortable story burns. And what remains, when the comfortable story burns, is something that cannot be manipulated by approval because it does not need approval, something that cannot be paralyzed by fear of judgment because it has already judged itself and found the verdict livable. Something that moves through the world with the quiet, dense, gravitational certainty of a person who has looked at reality without flinching and decided, not despite what they saw but because of it, to act. This is not a conclusion, it is a beginning. The architecture is in you now. The 5 pillars are not abstract. They are the structural bones of a new operating system, installed in this hour, available the moment you choose to use it. In the next conversation you have, in the next room you enter, in the next decision you face where the old story would have kept you small and the new clarity demands something larger. Use it without apology. Machiavelli did not apologize for seeing clearly. The Rothschilds did not apologize for playing the long game. Musk does not apologize for operating from sovereignty. And you, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever your current position, whatever the gap between where you stand and where you intend to go, you do not need to apologize for claiming the intelligence, the clarity, and the sovereign authority over your own life that has always, without exception, been yours to claim. Go now, and let your silence be your strategy. Let your patience be your weapon. Let your clarity be your authority. Let your presence be undeniable, not because you performed it, but because you built it, pillar by pillar, in the long dark, before anyone was watching. If this message has landed where it was aimed, if somewhere in the hour of this video you felt the specific, unmistakable sensation of a truth being named that you already knew but had not yet allowed yourself to hold, then leave below the only words that matter. I play the long game, and I play it alone. This is not a comment. It is a declaration. It is the signature of someone who has crossed from the outside of this philosophy to the inside of it, and who has no intention of going back. And if you want to go deeper, if you understand that this hour was an opening and not an ending, an introduction to a way of seeing that will continue to reveal its dimensions the longer you practice it, then subscribe to this channel. Not because subscribing changes your life, but because you are the kind of person who builds things, who takes the long view, who understands that the most important investments are the ones whose returns are not immediately visible, and who recognizes that a community of people who think this way, who refuse the comfortable story, who have chosen clarity over consolation, who operate from sovereignty rather than seeking permission, is one of the rarest and most valuable things in the modern world. Subscribe, not as a click, as a commitment, to the game, to the clarity, to the version of yourself that this hour began to reveal. Go now. And remember what Machiavelli knew above all else. Fortune favors the prepared, not the talented, not the fortunate, not the beloved, the prepared. Prepare.